Thanks, Grace. Great to be here in the British Museum, just down the road. I used to work at UCL, so this feels nice to come back to Bloomsbury. And I'm going to talk today about ketamine-assisted therapy to target addiction. So I'm a professor at the University of Exeter, but I'm also seconded to work with Awakn Life Sciences on their ketamine treatment programs. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I probably don't need to say, addiction, either be it substance use disorders or behavioural addictions, one of the leading causes of death and disability in the world, and the mental health problem with the highest relapse rates. So there really is a huge treatment need here. And what I thought I'd do today is a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the work that we have ongoing with Awakn. So in various different stages of development. So we've got some kind of advanced clinical work. So we've just started our phase 3 trial of ketamine-assisted therapy in alcohol use disorder here in the UK. So I'm very excited about that. But also I'm going to talk a little bit about some earlier stage work we've been doing just to try and understand a little bit more about how this treatment works. I mean, we see ketamine as working synergistically with the therapy. So looking at how those two work together, really to try and better tailor and design the therapies in the future. And we've also been looking at some novel routes of administration of ketamine to try and help with widening access in the future. So I'm going to talk about two kind of quite different mechanisms we've been exploring. One is looking at enhancing engagement with treatment, and the other is looking at plasticity. And then I'm going to talk very briefly, if I don't run out of time, about some work we've been doing, again, on the other end of things, looking at how you might implement these therapies in the NHS and how we might develop a registry of patients being treated with ketamine. So starting off really, first of all, I wanted to talk about why we would look at ketamine as an adjunct to therapy. And a colleague of mine the other day said, ketamine has no friends, and ketamine is often seen as the kind of poor relative or maybe like the dodgy uncle of psilocybin. But actually I think ketamine has some benefits that make it something that's potentially very useful and some unique benefits to ketamine. And some of those are that it has got this robust pattern of psychedelic effects, and it's quite sometimes contentious to call ketamine a psychedelic because people say it doesn't work on the 5-HT2A receptor. But actually I would counter that Humphrey Osmond, who came up with the term psychedelic, actually included nitrous oxide in his category of psychedelics, and nitrous oxide works as an antagonist of the NMDA receptor, much like ketamine. And actually, I mean, this is some work that wasn't designed to look at this, done principally by Rennie, I think he's somewhere in the audience. We were looking at subjective reports of drug users from Erowid, so like thousands of reports, and doing some machine learning on them, trying to classify them linguistically on similarity. And Rennie's been extracting clusters from that, and there's some lower level clusters, but these are the sort of super clusters that emerge. And you can see, I don't know if you can see actually, we don't know where the pointer is, but in this quite confusing mess, actually, the yellow section seemed to be a group of drugs. And this is if we look at the subjective effects of drugs and just categorize people based on those, that there seems to be a category of drugs that's based really on their perceptual distortions and consciousness-changing properties. And that includes ketamine, includes LSD, ayahuasca, and psilocybin. And then actually, interestingly, MDMA comes into a different cluster of drugs with kind of more predictable effects. This study wasn't set out to show that ketamine is a psychedelic, but I thought it's sort of relevant here. But ketamine also has other properties that makes it a useful tool right now, particularly. And one of those is that it's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. So it's probably the most common or useful analgesic and anesthetic in the world, and it has very potent analgesic anesthetic effects. It's also on Schedule 2, and it's something that is known to physicians. And I think in that way, that ketamine is a kind of more accessible. We know that medics generally are quite a risk-averse group of people, so the fact that ketamine's there is something they can look up here in the UK in the British National Formulary is something to its strength. And also it's got a short half-life, so the ketamine effects are quite short in duration. So people have the kind of peak effects over an hour and then fully recovered, usually within 3 hours. So it's actually all of these things together make ketamine quite easy to implement as a treatment right now. And that's what we're doing, so that's handy. So we've just started our phase 3 trial here in the UK, which we have called More Care, which is very imaginative because we called our phase 2B trial CARE, which is care with a K, because we wanted to make kind of ketamine alcohol treatment sound a little bit softer. And I won't dwell on this too much because I've talked about it quite a lot. And this is published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. But this was our kind of treatment design for our phase 2B that generated the data to take us on to phase 3. So essentially, we randomized 96 patients to receive one of two drug conditions. So that was either 3 infusions of ketamine at 0.8 milligrams per kilogram over 40 minutes, or 3 infusions of placebo over the same time. And within that, we had people given therapy or not therapy. We had a kind of therapy control we called alcohol education. So we had ketamine with therapy, ketamine without therapy, placebo with therapy, and placebo without therapy in this kind of fully factorial design. And we looked at primary outcomes, which were essentially drinking outcomes, so the percentage days abstinent, and we looked at relapse at 6 months. And that's the general design of our trial. Our therapy, just to give you a bit of information about that, because it's kind of relevant to understanding this and the subsequent phase 3, because it's the same therapy we're using. And with 7 hour-and-a-half long, very manualized sessions of therapy, so quite different to some of the other approaches that we have seen in psychedelic-assisted therapy. That Amir was talking about some of the issues with scalability. So here we used it's like guided self-help. It was delivered by a low-intensity psychological wellbeing practitioner. And so that's a workforce trained here in the UK to deliver CBT principally, but very trained on manualized therapies. And we combined within our kind of guided self-help booklet existing evidence-based approaches. Largely, this was mindfulness-based relapse prevention and motivational interviewing. And we, as I said, we manualized this and really quite scripted it to also ensure fidelity to treatment, but also that it be something that could be delivered by a relatively less skilled therapist. So what was included in the protocols was often quite concrete risk reduction strategies, so things like identifying high-risk situations, how to cope with cravings, and then more kind of CBT approaches, so restructuring unhelpful thinking. And then we had a kind of section called Promoting Wellbeing, which included mindfulness practice. And there was an element of the therapy where people were prepared for their ketamine experience and had a little bit of time to debrief about their dosing. So that was our kind of therapeutic approach. And the way it worked in practice was a very kind of intense, almost like a brief intervention, really, that people had a session of therapy, an hour and a half, and then immediately afterwards they had an infusion of ketamine. And then they recovered for a couple of hours, and then they came back the next day for another session of therapy, again, an hour and a half long. And they repeated that for 3 weeks. And sometimes we needed larger gaps in between to fit around people's schedules, but that was the broad model. And then on the final week, they had a final session of therapy, and that was all. And then we followed people up at 6 months. And so what we found were we had 2 primary outcomes. So one of them was relapse, and that was no days of drinking within 6 months, and that we didn't reach our primary endpoints on that, but we did on the percentage days abstinent from alcohol. And here you can see, so in the yellow, I don't know if there is a point. In yellow is the ketamine and therapy group. In the green, the ketamine and education. So that was our ketamine and no therapy control. In the red, placebo and therapy, and the blue, placebo and education. And you can see we saw the greatest effects in the group given ketamine and therapy. And we found 86% of them were still abstinent at 6 months. So that was great. And we also saw some other improvements in secondary outcomes, some of which are these, improved liver function, reductions in things like rumination, anhedonia. And interestingly, we found this was predicted, these reductions in rumination and anhedonia, by family history of alcohol problems. I don't really have time to get into that now, but this sort of led us on to design our phase 3 trial, so we thought these results were encouraging. So this trial started in March 2023. We haven't actually seen any patients yet. As some of you may be aware, these take a long time to set up. At the moment, the MHRA here in the UK is deathly slow. But the study is funded a third by Awakn Life Sciences and 2/3 by our NIHR, so our National Institute for Health Research. It's essentially our Department for Health. We're running the study at 9, potentially 10 NHS trusts across the UK, so from Manchester, Sheffield, Oxford, Glasgow, a couple in London, Devon, obviously where I am, and some others. And yeah, as I mentioned, we started in March, and we've just submitted for our regulatory approvals. And given the way the timelines are looking at the moment, we're anticipating to see our first patient in December 2023. And so this design is a kind of simplified one and slightly adapted based on feedback from the reviewers when we submitted our grant. So this will see 280 patients across these 10 sites. Again, all of them will receive 3 infusions of ketamine. There's 7 sessions of either therapy or this education support model over 40 minutes. Our placebo group now receive a kind of subtherapeutic dose of ketamine. And I don't think that particularly helps with blinding, but we did have a few people in the original phase 2 trial dropped out because they perceived they're not to be in the ketamine group. So it helps a little bit with expectation to say you'll receive 1 of 2 doses of ketamine, and whether it will be that helpful in the end. But yeah, I don't imagine that will really help, particularly with any of these blinding issues. But that's the design we've adopted. So we've added in some aspects to this trial that we didn't have in the first one. Oh, thanks, Cecilia. That's handy. I don't need it anymore. I will need it in a minute. So outside the primary outcome assessment is at 6 months, but something that people reported in the phase 2 was that they really wanted to talk to other people who'd had these experiences, understandably. And, we're dealing with a group in recovery from alcohol, so there's a great model in terms of the 12-step program. So what we're doing is introducing some online peer support groups, not necessarily with the 12-step model. We're working with some external organisations, and that will culminate in a kind of celebration, nature connection weekend. But that hopefully can be ongoing and self-sustaining, so we'll give people a kind of manual to run these groups by. So we'll have to see how that works out. Quite excited about that bit, really, that the potential to build a community around this. We're also using natural language processing throughout with some of our colleagues to look at predicting treatment outcomes from small snippets of speech and then some journaling that people do throughout the study. We're excited to be working with IBM to develop a kind of therapist companion which gives people prompts, the therapist prompts for things to say throughout this. I mean, it's not at that stage yet, so it's very, very early stages. We're also using wearables. In our original trial, we did have a kind of wearable, but it was like this horribly stigmatizing, massive thing that looked like you're on day release from prison that measured your alcohol. But now things have come on and it looks a little bit like a Fitbit. And hopefully will be part of a kind of treatment package for the people involved. And we've got a really kind of ambitious program of patient involvement and implementation research throughout the trial. And I'll talk about that in a minute, hopefully, if I have time. So we've developed this program based largely on mindfulness-based relapse prevention. And we are now rolling it out across all these NHS sites. But we don't actually really know how it works and whether this, is the best therapy alongside ketamine. So we thought we'd kind of scale back and do some mechanistic studies, looking at what might be the interplay between ketamine, mindfulness, and other processes in therapy. So this study is a really small study. That's Emily, who's in the audience, led. So I've got a picture of her up there. And this was using S-ketamine. So it was an oral thin film form of S-ketamine. So that's just like little sort of strips that you stick inside your cheek. So it's really easy to work with. It's something that's being repurposed with a European pharmaceutical company. And we used 28 harmful drinkers, basically students, which are quite easy to come by. So people who meet criteria for mild alcohol use disorder. And the protocol design, really, people came in for screening, and then they had a little bit of training in mindfulness, meditation around addiction, and they said they were willing to be abstinent from alcohol for 14 days, so not a very long time. And so when they were randomized, and they were given this mindfulness preparation, and then sent daily mindfulness recordings, so they were required to do a daily kind of mindfulness practice. And we charted a number of things, but what I'll talk about here is engagement. So that was in terms of physical engagement, the number of meditation sessions they engaged with, and also their psychological engagement with the process. So they did 7 days of daily meditation, and they came back, and then we gave them a single dose of this oral thin film, S-ketamine, or vitamin C oral thin film. And then they went away again and did another 7 days of meditation practice. So it's a really simple study, And what we found, I mean, these are really early results, and, so, yeah. That's wrong. Yeah, it's something we've just looked at, but I thought it's kind of interesting. So in terms of alcohol craving, so this was not a clinical trial, it's just a mechanistic study, so we don't have any clinical outcomes, but we did look at alcohol craving, and what we found was following the ketamine, alcohol craving reduced dramatically in the ketamine group, as we might expect, and slightly increased in the placebo. At the end of the 14 days of meditation, the two groups were the same, which I think is quite encouraging about meditation practice. But what we found in terms of engagement was following the ketamine. The engagement in the ketamine group went up dramatically. And what I thought was particularly interesting is when we did a mediation analysis, so there's a relationship between the ketamine and the craving, but that's wholly accounted for by the engagement with the practice. Now, these are really early results, but I think it's just kind of interesting to think of all the different things that might be going on in these really complicated therapies, where we're giving a therapy and a drug at the same time, and all the different mechanisms that might be at work. So yeah, just, a kind of summary of the findings of that study. There are other bits to it, but I'm trying to keep it quite brief here, that we found changes in alcohol craving with just 14 days of guided home meditation practice, which I think is really interesting, and that we used this oral thin film as ketamine, which was actually really, really easy to use, and so something when we think about scaling out any of these treatments into actual drug and alcohol services, that might be something much more, it's certainly a lot easier to use than currently we're giving people intravenous infusions. And we did find very robust subjective effects, which I haven't presented here. And then this increase in engagement is really interesting, and engagement is composed of lots of things, and I think we really need to dig into it. So is this kind of motivational effect where people are more engaged with the practice, or is it that the intention somehow becomes stronger? Some people have said that maybe the ketamine experience is a sort of experiential stepping stone to mindfulness practice. So it enables people, then it becomes a bit easier. And so then that would be responsible for greater engagement. Or is there some sort of increase in cognitive capacity following this treatment? And that's maybe something our results with plasticity might speak to. But yeah, I think engagement is really interesting in running clinical trials. And I work quite closely with a lot of people in the humanities in our university, and we're often critiqued for trying to colonize the mystical experience scientifically. And actually, so engagement seems like something maybe a lot safer for us to look at within a clinical trials framework. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on it from probably spending too much time with philosophers. But yeah, so very briefly, oh dear, I'm very much out of time. But I'll just whistle through this as a study that we did with gambling use disorder, and looking at plasticity, so another kind of mechanism, again, a mechanistic study, not a clinical trial. So based on, and I think, people have alluded to this, so I won't go into it, but the idea that both ketamine and classic psychedelics might have this convergent action on kind of downstream neurobiological mechanisms that relate to neuroplasticity. And obviously there's lots of different types of neuroplasticity. And the speakers today have already talked about, some of the work about the critical window. And so we were focused at looking at synaptogenesis in terms of long-term potentiation. And this was our overall protocol, and there's a couple of people involved in it sitting in the audience, so thanks for all of your work. And yeah, I won't be talking about very much of this indeed, but just really focusing on our EEG findings, which are very preliminary, so they're like hot off the mat lab. And so we just had a look at this the other day, but thought it was quite interesting. So in this study, people came in and did some baseline measures, and they came back in and 3 days later and then had a dose of ketamine. And both those days they did some EEG, and they did this visual long-term potentiation task. And then we did a number of online follow-ups to look at changes in gambling symptoms and other psychopathological symptoms. So in this, we recruited 39 participants who met criteria for gambling disorder on the problem gambling severity index. And we gave them, this was a different formulation of ketamine, so just 100 milligrams of sublingual ketamine, so quite a low dose compared to placebo, which was lactose. This was, I've only got 1.5 minutes. Well, just basically, we were looking at plasticity with this paradigm, which Rachel Sumner and Meg Spriggs and we're really Suresh Maxwami in New Zealand has kind of used in this field before, and it's Alex Shaw at Exeter who is kind of doing this bit. And I guess the take home from it, as I've only got a minute left, was that we found that even at this low dose ketamine, we found a signal of an enhanced LTP effect in our ketamine subjects in terms of like kind of reduced negativity in the N1. But there was no link to gambling severity or depressive symptoms. We don't have time for that going around. So yeah, I might just skip over this bit and go to talking about implementing ketamine, because this is something I'm really passionate about as we're starting to roll out this treatment more widely. And throughout the phase 3, we've been talking and working with patients. And it's really interesting. The stuff they say, like some of this is quite mundane, but it's really important in understanding, both from people working in services, how these treatments might actually roll out. And it was really helpful. You know, we've got the accelerated licensing pathway from the MHRA. And the fact that we've been and spoken to patients about their needs and their reservations about these treatments was really helpful. 3 seconds. So yeah, I think it's really important that we do this research and implementation. And we're doing this for our phase 3. And we urgently really need a registry of ketamine patients. The kind of ketamine cat's already out the bag, particularly in the US. And I think that, you know, ketamine is not without its risks. It's a great drug and it's got a lot of potential use, but there is a potential for dependence. So with other colleagues, we're trying to set up this registry of patients. And I think it's really important because this is my kind of really rubbish joke. We don't want ketamine to be like a Trojan horse tranquilizer. It has the potential to lay the groundwork for introduction of psychedelics into mainstream medicine, but it could also drag all the other psychedelics down with it. So that's where I'll leave it. And thanks to all these people. Thanks for listening. Here's a plug for our course.